The crowd erupted in cruel laughter when Samuel paid 50 cents for the injured woman. Their mockery died when she became his salvation. Sagebrush Valley, Montana. The harsh winter of 1889, cold winds swept across Sagebrush Valley's main street, carrying dust and broken dreams past the weathered boots of men whose hearts had frozen long before the season turned bitter. Under a canvas tent that sagged with the weight of snow and sorrow, the final names echoed from a ledger marked by moisture and coal dust. Emma Hartwell, called the man conducting the proceedings. The sound of a carved walking stick tapping against wooden planks broke the silence. From the shadows stepped a figure that drew every Aja woman of perhaps 27 years, lean from hardship. Her auburn hair was pulled back in an attempt at dignity, though the ends bore traces of ash from countless cooking fires. Her right leg moved stiffly, supported by a brace crafted from salvaged materials. Her gaze remained fixed downward, having long since learned what cruelty lived in the faces of strangers. A harsh whistle cut through the air, followed by cruel words. "Nobody's paying good money for damaged goods," someone shouted. She stumbled over her own shadow, another voice added, sparking more laughter that cracked like ice in the freezing air. Emma's expression remained unchanged. Her lips pressed together as though holding back something precious, perhaps the last remnant of her pride. The auctioneer, clearly uncomfortable with the proceedings, tugged at his collar. Opening bid set at 10 cents for household duties and basic sewing work. 50 cents, came a voice that silenced every tongue. From the crowd's edge emerged a figure tall and weathered, wrapped in a heavy brown coat, his salt and pepper beard neatly trimmed. His eyes held the hardness of forged steel. Samuel Blackwood, the valley's most reclusive rancher, stepped forward with measured steps. He hadn't attended these winter gatherings since his beloved wife had passed, not since he'd shuttered half his homestead and let the gardens surrender to weeds. Some whispered he'd grown bitter in his solitude. Others claimed he simply preferred silence to small talk. None had expected him to bid on anyone. 50 cents, the auctioneer echoed.
"How uncertain."
Samuel reached into his coat without hesitation, placing the coins firmly into the man's outstretched palm. The metallic clink echoed in the sudden quiet. Emma's eyes lifted for the first time, not with gratitude or hope, but with pure bewilderment. The gathered crowd shifted uncomfortably, their whispers dying to nothing. A woman near the front leaned toward her companion and muttered, "That man just purchased himself trouble." Samuel turned toward Emma. "She requires shelter," he stated. Simply, his voice like weathered wood. "I have plenty." He faced her again, not extending his hand or offering assistance, merely looking at her with an expression that seemed to say, "The choice is yours to make." And indeed it was. Emma studied. The stranger who had just paid 50 cents for a woman the world had discarded. His face held neither pity nor cruelty, only a deep stillness, the look of someone who'd discovered that silence carried less pain than hope. She descended from the platform, each strike of her walking stick against the frozen ground marking time like a bell tolling in an abandoned chapel. They walked through the crowd without another word. The mockery had ceased. Gossip would surely follow. But in that single moment there was only the rhythm of her uneven steps and the respectful distance he maintained beside her. Somehow that quiet space felt kinder than any word spoken to her in years. The wind had settled by the time Emma crossed the threshold of Samuel Blackwood's ranch house. But the silence within ran deeper than anything the Montana wilderness could produce. He spoke no words as he guided her through the shadowy corridor, her unsteady footsteps creating a symphony with the creaking floorboards. At the house's far end, beside a cold iron stove, Samuel opened a door to a modest room. "This belongs to you now," he said without ceremony. The space contained a single bed, folded blanket at its foot, and a wash basin resting on a small stand. Nothing decorative, no welcoming touches carved into the walls, just space and peace. Yet his eyes held no pity, only something more solid, the kind of quiet strength one could lean upon when tired of falling. He departed without another word in the days that followed. Conversation remained scarce. Samuel rose before dawn's light, cared for the animals, split wood, and disappeared into the vast fields. Emma stayed close to the house, uncertain of her duties or boundaries, yet each morning brought small discoveries on the kitchen table: fresh bread on a plate, warm water in the pitcher, once even a bright red apple, always wordless, always appearing as if by magic. So she began to move through the space with her hand-carved walking stick, fashioned from a branch she'd whittled herself during harder times. She worked quietly through the house, stoking the stove, kneading dough from stored flour. She hung washing to dry in the mountain air, cleared ashes from the hearth, mastered the art of coaxing warmth from the stubborn Montana cold. But Sagebrush Valley kept watch. News traveled swiftly. Children from town would venture near the property line, pointing and whispering. "There's the crippled woman," one would sneer. "Bought for 50 cents, same as a lame horse." They hurled pebbles never hard enough to harm, just sharp enough to sting. Emma never responded to their taunts, never showed pain. She would simply turn away and return to her sweeping, baking, and mending. But when darkness fell and the wind howled around the eaves, she would sit by her window wrapped in the thin blanket, watching moonlight dance across the frost-covered land, and wondering whether her existence would ever amount to more than charity, something broken that decent men like Samuel rescued out of duty. Then she noticed him. Samuel stood by the woodpile, his coat dusted with snow, quietly stacking logs beneath her window. His work was methodical, unhurried, performed without expectation of recognition. After placing the final piece, he drew another blanket from his coat, folded it carefully, and set it atop the pile. He lingered there a moment, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. He didn't glance toward her window or announce his presence. He simply remained still, as though offering warmth was the only language he'd ever mastered. Then he turned and vanished into the house. Emma remained frozen. At the window, her fingers gripping the sill, tears burning her eyes, breath caught in her throat. No one had asked her to remain. But equally important, no one had ever told her to leave. That night, alone in the darkness, surrounded by silence and snow, Emma Hartwell wept not from fear or shame, but from quiet, overwhelming disbelief. For the first time in her life, someone had faced the world's judgment and chosen not to discard her. By the fourth week, Emma moved through the house with growing confidence. Her limp persisted, but she leaned less heavily on her makeshift walking stick. The rhythm of survival had transformed into the rhythm of care, sweeping the porch before sunrise, working dough with weathered hands, pulling weeds from the stubborn vegetable patch that clung to life behind the barn. She mended Samuel's clothing in the evenings, never asking permission. She simply noticed a missing button here, a worn cuff there, and stitched in silence while flames danced in the fireplace. Samuel spoke little, but one morning when she brought his coffee to the porch, steam rising from the metal cup, she discovered something waiting beside it: a small wildflower, delicate, violet at the edges, placed neatly next to the mug he made. No mention of it, simply took his coffee, nodded once, and walked into the field. Emma stared at the bloom for a long while before pressing it between the pages of her cherished hymnal. It should have been a moment of simple kindness, but Sagebrush Valley thrived on gossip. During her next visit to the general store, heads turned and whispers followed. He's lost his reason. The Blackwood, taking her in, one woman muttered loud enough for all to hear. "Might as well have wed a phantom," another replied. "I wager she wears his dead wife's belongings." Emma pretended deafness, but their words clung to her like smoke. That evening, as she cleaned vegetables by lamplight, her hands trembled. She remembered the auction, the way men laughed at her disability, how they discussed her like livestock. Now here she stood, preparing meals in a stranger's kitchen, wearing a borrowed apron, mending clothes she could never afford independently. Was she merely a ghost of the woman he had lost? A replacement? A shadow? She nearly packed her belongings at night, the few items she possessed, but stopped when she heard the front door open. Samuel entered, carrying the scent of hay and frost and honest work. He observed the table, the stew she'd simmered all afternoon, the clean cloth laid beside his chair, the evidence of care in every corner of the room. He didn't sit immediately. Just surveyed everything, then looked at her standing by the stove with a cloth in her hand. "You work harder than most men I've employed," he said quietly. Then he sat, drew the bowl toward him, and began eating. Her heart beat steadily. She was uncertain of what lay ahead, but sure she wouldn't flee from it. The incident occurred on the final warm day before winter's return. Samuel had taken his black horse up the mountain trail, tracking a wayward calf. Watched from the porch as dust rose behind him, his silhouette fading into the golden afternoon light. He hadn't returned by sunset. By moonrise, she saw the horse return without its rider. They found him by lantern light. Unconscious beneath brittle grass, breathing shallowly, blood at his temple. The mare had likely been spooked, perhaps by a snake or snapping branch. Samuel remembered nothing of the fall. Emma brought him home, managing his weight onto the cart while whispering prayers. She boiled water, crushed herbs with shaking fingers, pressed cloths against the bruising that bloomed across his ribs. He muttered in fever, flinching at her touch, and once, as she bent to cool his forehead, she heard it clearly. Rebecca. The name barely escaped his cracked lips, but it was unmistakable, his wife, gone nearly a decade now, whose portrait still hung by the mantel. Emma didn't stop tending him, but she spoke no more that night. For 2 days she sat beside his bed, watching the rise and fall of his chest, feeding him broth he couldn't taste, singing softly to the walls as much as to him. When he finally opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was her bent over with exhaustion, the hem of her dress damp from snow she'd knelt in while gathering healing herbs. He stared for a moment, then turned his head away. Afterward, Samuel spoke even less. He kept to himself, spent long hours in the barn, ate his meals standing. When she offered him tea, he nodded without meeting her gaze. The silence returned, but heavier now, not peaceful but guilty. His old friend Joshua noticed when he came by to deliver supplies, finding Samuel splitting wood, like a man trying to prove something to himself. "You should rest, Samuel," Joshua said, eyeing the bandage still wrapped around his ribs. Samuel shook his head. "Resting makes it worse."
"How?"
Joshua chuckled. "You always were stubborn." A pause, then quieter. "She's good for you, that woman." Samuel's hands stilled on the axe. "She's half my age," he muttered. "What kind of man has such feelings?" "An honest one," Joshua replied. Samuel exhaled slowly. "Maybe I'm just lonely." What he didn't know was that Emma stood behind the door, hands clenched in her skirt's folds, breath caught between fury and heartbreak. So that was her worth merely a remedy for loneliness, a substitute for something he'd lost. The thought cut deeper than any insult from town. That night, she packed her few possessions, folded her apron, rolled her shawl tight, tucked the flower he'd once given her between hymnal pages. Rain struck the roof in steady, cold sheets. The time Samuel noticed the open door, she was already halfway to the tree line, boots sinking into mud. "Emma," he called. She didn't turn. He caught up with her at the gate, breathing hard, one hand pressed against his ribs. "You can't walk out in this," he said. "Not in your condition." She faced him, soaked to the bone. "Don't concern yourself. I'm accustomed to being left in the rain." He flinched. "That's not what I meant." She looked away. "You said I was just loneliness, that I was too young, that this whatever this is was wrong." His voice was low, steady. "I said I didn't know what kind of man feels this way. I never said the feeling was wrong." Paused then quietly. "If it's wrong to want peace, then let me be wrong one more time in my life." The rain slowed. Emma stood, still blinking against the wind. Samuel reached for her bag, took it gently from her shoulder, slung it over his own. Then he offered his hand not as a command, not as rescue, but as a place to belong. M.A. After one long breath, took it. The wind howled that night like a warning beyond understanding. Snow hadn't yet fallen, but cold, bit deep, and the moon hung low over the sagebrush hills, pale as old bone. Samuel had gone out late after hearing strange sounds near the southern, corralled something unsettling in the movement of livestock. Emma had urged him to wait for morning, but Samuel was stubborn. As always, he'd taken only a lantern and the old pistol from the mantel. She waited by the hearth, attempting to read, but her eyes kept drifting to the door. Then came the gunshot. Not aimed, but sharp and close, followed by the sound of panicked cattle. She ran outside, barefoot, breath smoking in the air, heart pounding. They had come in a group, faces covered, boots thick with mud rustlers, seeking to steal what they thought was unguarded. But Samuel had fought. It was clear from the bruises on his face, the blood pooling beneath his collar when Emma found him collapsed by the barn wall. He wasn't moving. Her breath caught. For a moment, the world narrowed to her own heartbeat and the whistle of wind through broken boards. Then she moved, not to scream or cry, but to act. She dragged Samuel inside, struggling with his weight. Her leg burned with each step, but she didn't stop. When he was safe by the fire, she grabbed the rifle from above the kitchen door, a relic. Samuel rarely touched hand, headed back outside. The rustlers were still by the corral, wrestling with the gate. Emma raised the rifle. She had never fired it before. The kick knocked her backward when she pulled the trigger. But the shot cracked through the valley like thunder. They froze. A second shot rang into the air, deliberate this time. Then she shouted, her voice steadier than expected, "The next one won't miss." The men looked at each other, and they ran. She stood for a long moment after, hands trembling around the wooden stock, chest rising and falling with effort. The cattle calmed. Snow still didn't fall. Morning came pale and slow. Word spread faster than wildfire. By noon, several townsfolk had ridden up, more curious than concerned. One of them, the same man who had once laughed at the auction, stared at the bullet hole in the barn post. Heard she drove them off with Samuel's old rifle, he muttered. Another, the merchant's wife, nodded toward the house. They say she patched him up too. Sat by him all night. No one laughed that day. Inside, Samuel stirred. The bruises on his face had deepened. His ribs were bandaged tight. The room was quiet, except for the crackle of fire and the soft, even breathing of Emma asleep in a chair beside him, arms folded, hair falling loose. He turned his head, winced, then saw her clearly. Her hands were blistered, a faint smudge of soot across her cheek. The rifle leaned against the wall, unloaded now, and beside it her boots, still damp, still muddy from where she'd run through frost and fear. He didn't speak. He simply reached out, his hand finding hers across the armrest. She woke at the touch. Their eyes met. Samuel's voice was steady. "You saved my life," he said. A pause, then softer. "But you were already part of it before that," Winter had claimed. Sagebrush Valley once again. Days were brief, winds sharp, and the valley wore white, so still it seemed the world had stopped breathing. One morning, Emma returned from the town market with flushed cheeks and her basket full of dried corn and coarse thread. But her eyes carried something else, an unease she couldn't quite hide. A man had spoken to her. William Morrison, a widower only a few years her senior, known for his fine woodwork and hopeful disposition. He had approached her near the livery stable and made his offer plainly, respectfully. "I heard you're not wed to the rancher. I've got a place near the creeked land, too. Maybe you'd consider a future with someone closer to your years." Emma had looked at the snow falling on his boots. Then, with more peace than sadness, she answered, "I already have a home." William had nodded once, respectful, but the words followed her home like dust clinging to her coat. She said nothing of it to Samuel, but he knew. He saw it in the way her hands lingered on the coffee pot, how her eyes watched the snow longer than usual. That night, as Emma sat by the fire, unraveling a worn scarf to reuse the yarn, Samuel stepped outside without explanation. The next few days he worked with quiet purpose. Boards were hauled, hinges repaired, an old key was filed smooth. Emma watched from the porch, puzzled. Until one morning he led her to the property's northern edge, where an old structure had long stood unused. The small cabin, once his first home with his late wife, had stood locked and forgotten under moss and memory. But now it was different. The door opened without complaint. Inside, sunlight filtered through new glass. A sturdy table stood near the window. Shelves lined the walls, empty, and waiting. A rocking chair sat in the corner beside a chest of clean linens and a small cast-iron stove. Emma turned slowly. On the shelf nearest the window, one book sat alone, a cloth-bound guide to needlework and household crafts. The name inside, handwritten in fading ink, Rebecca Blackwood. Her throat caught. Samuel didn't speak. He simply stepped beside her and said, "Figured you could use space of your own. Steady hands make finer seams." Left her there, and when the door closed softly behind him, Emma stood for a long while, one hand resting on the book's spine, the other brushing a tear from her cheek. He had not asked her to stay. He had not given her a ring. But this was more. And so she stayed. No one in Sagebrush Valley ever heard them speak vows. But they saw Emma walking beside Samuel to the general store, Samuel pulling her chair closer to the stove before she sat, her mending his shirts with extra care along the seams, him picking herbs she favored and leaving them in jars above the sink. They shared meals, shared quiet, shared winters and harvests. And Sunday evenings, when snow tapped gently at the glass, neither said a word, because nothing was missing. The townsfolk, once full of whispers and scorn, had grown quiet too. Now they nodded in greeting. Some even waved. One old man muttered, "She gentled the wilderness in him, that woman." Another replied, "And he gave her roots no wind could shake." Then came the blizzard, arrived without warning, swallowing fence posts, darkening skies. Samuel had been outside too long repairing a leak near the stable. When he returned, frost clung to his beard, and his hands shook as Emma wrapped him in quilts, scolding softly under her breath. That night, she sat by the fire, knitting slowly with blue-gray wool. Her fingers moved in rhythm with the flames, slow and steady. Samuel returned from the other room, a small parcel wrapped in flannel in his hands. He offered it without ceremony. She unwrapped it, a scarf, thick and warm, but stitched into one. And, carefully burned into the fabric with his branding iron, were 4 words, "You made me live again." Emma held it against her chest, eyes bright in the firelight. No words passed between them. But when she reached out and placed her hand on his, Samuel laced their fingers together. It was not a wedding. It was not a vow. But it was enough. By spring's end, the hills around Sagebrush Valley had thawed into rolling green. Snowmelt fed the streams, and wildflowers crept along fence lines like soft-colored secrets. But behind Samuel's barn, in a small corral marked with broken rails and patient waiting, Emma Hartwell was working with something else that had been broken. Young chestnut mare with a damaged foreleg, lame since birth and left behind when her herd was sold. Most folks would have put her down. Samuel had almost done it himself. But Emma had stepped between man and beast with her gentle voice and unwavering eyes. "Let me try," she had said. "I understand how to walk with pain." First, the animal refused her touch, flinched from the halter, shied when she approached. But Emma felt no fear. Each morning, before the sun had fully warmed the land, she'd bring a handful of oats, her voice steady as she read aloud from old books or hummed low, forgotten melodies. The mare began to come closer, then to stay. Named her Copper and Emma were alike in more ways than one. Both had scarred gaits, hesitation in their step, but fire behind their eyes. And slowly, like healing from the inside out, they taught each other to trust the weight of moving forward. One morning, Samuel stepped onto the porch and saw her Emma on Copper's back, riding bareback, hands loose on the reins. Posture straight. She didn't gallop. She rode slow, deliberate. The limp in her leg mirrored by the shift in Copper's stride. But they moved together like water, finding its path through stone. Samuel smiled, wide and proud. That same day, Emma carried a small wooden board to the oak behind the barn, nailed it upright, and began carving letters into its surface with the edge of a knife. By the following week, 3 children from the edge of Sagebrush Valley came each morning, barefoot and wide-eyed. Emma gave them chalk made from crushed stone and taught them to draw letters in the dust. She taught them the names of birds, how to sound out kindness, and what it meant to wait for a question before answering news spread. More children came. They sat on old crates and quilts, huddled close while she read from memory and from Samuel's donated Bible. When they grew restless, she taught them how to listen to wind through pine, to trace their own names in sandy lines. The townsfolk took notice. The quiet woman teaches now, they murmured, the one Samuel brought back from nothing. But they no longer said it with scorn. They watched from behind fences as their children returned home calmer, full of strange new words and flower-pressed bookmarks, and they began to call her something else, the gentle heart of Sagebrush Valley. It was not a title Emma chose. But one day at the market, a woman placed a warm hand on her arm and said, "My daughter reads now. That's because of you." Emma nodded, unsure how to answer, but she carried the words home like a wrapped gift. That evening, she rode copper through the center of town, sitting tall in her handmade dress, hair braided down her back, eyes steady on the horizon. People tipped hats. Some waved. She didn't wave back. She didn't need to. She was not a visitor here anymore. When she returned to the ranch, Samuel was on the porch sharpening a blade. He looked up. For a long moment he said nothing, just watched. Her dismount with practiced grace, limp and all. Then, almost too quietly to hear, he said, "She rides like she belongs." Emma didn't respond. She just smiled, patted Copper's neck, and walked past him, toward the warm light of home. And Samuel grizzled. Silent Samuel watched her go with something like wonder etched in the corners of his eyes. Spring arrived early in Sagebrush Valley that year. Frost melted from the silver fence posts, and small green shoots peeked through. Cracks along the weathered porch, just where Emma once sat, mending shirts while Samuel carved timber nearby. The silence that used to hang over the ranch like morning mist had lifted. In its place came the soft laughter of children, the rustle of petals, and the scent of sage carried on the wind. The old cabin had changed. A bright kitchen had been added, with wide windows that opened to the meadow. Off to the side, a schoolroom stewed, modest space with a blackboard carved from slate and rows of hand-stitched cloth books. Wildflowers bloomed along the porch in sun-drenched waves. Emma's touch was everywhere. She had planted sage, white daisies, and bold yellow sunflowers. Each morning Samuel could be found watering the beds, while Emma gathered bundles into baskets or arranged them along the sills. He built benches for the children who came to learn, carving their names into the wood with the same careful hands that once mended fence wire. They were not married. No rings were exchanged. But when asked, Emma would smile softly and say, "He is my home." Samuel, his hair more silver than gray now, worked slower these days, but he worked still with purpose. He had learned to carve without haste, to tend the garden with care, and to listen to Emma's humming from across the yard like it was the heartbeat of the place. They ate dinner beneath the open sky, side by side on the porch steps. Often they did not speak, there was no need. Sometimes it was a mug of ginger tea left just where Emma liked it, or a blanket Samuel unfolded before the rain came. It was not spoken love. It was chosen love, every day without fanfare. One morning a knock came at the door. A boy from town brought a folded notice. Sagebrush Valley was hosting its first spring bloom festival. The townsfolk asked Emma to bring flowers. She hesitated. "They don't need my flowers," she whispered. Samuel looked up from his whittling. "Let them see what blooms where love grows." And so she went. At the market, she laid out bunches of sage, small pails of wild sunflowers, jars of honey-sweet daisies. People gathered not just to buy but to see her. Some whispered, but most simply nodded. A woman who once scoffed now approached with a cane and steady eyes. She bought every last bouquet in the basket and leaned in close. "I used to think he paid too much," she said. "Now I think you were priceless." Emma said nothing, just bowed her head and blinked fast against the sun. That evening, when they returned home, Emma sat quietly near the sage bush by the porch. Samuel walked up behind her and set a small wooden box in her lap. Inside was a silver pen, tarnished at the edges, but still elegant, etched with the words, to the woman who made this house more than a place. She turned to look at him but said nothing. She didn't need to. She wrapped her arms around his middle, held him tight and steady like he had once steadied her on crutches through wind and fire and silence. The wind picked up, stirring the old wind chimes Samuel had fashioned from silver spoons. Each spoon, a different size. Each one a day, he had said, that she made me smile. That night, the children who studied with her gathered around the porch, bundled in wool and wide-eyed. Emma lit the lantern and told them a story, not from a book, but from memory. Once, she said, there was a lonely man who paid 50 cents for a limping woman. A child frowned. Paid for her. Emma nodded. Yes, that was the word they used. But he didn't buy her like a thing. He gave her shelter, and she gave him something money could not. Another child piped up. Did she love him? Emma's smile deepened, soft and sure. No, she said. She grew love with him. What? That is better. Inside the house, the kettle began to whistle. Outside, if anyone had been watching, they might have seen it all past the window where Samuel whittled spoons, past the porch where Emma hung flowers to dry, past the children laughing near the sunflowers. The wind chime rang gently in the evening air. Golden sunlight spilled across the wooden floorboards. A quiet voice, not Emma's. Not. Samuel's might have said he'd bought her for 50 cents. But she gave him something money never coulda, reason to live again. And together, they built not just a home, but a quiet, enduring kind of forever.